Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about a very fascinating aspect of a book that I've been reading. It's Curtis Peeble's 1995 book, Watch the Skies, A Chronicle of the Flying Saucer Myth. This goes through the history of flying saucers in the US. Now, it goes into a very interesting aspect, many interesting aspects, but the one that I found particularly interesting was the section about the CIA's interest in flying saucers. When many people hear about the CIA, they would assume that they're just interested in covering up flying saucers and that this would confirm the alien presence on Earth. But in fact, this is very different. The reality was very different. So why was the CIA interested in flying saucers? In the 1950s, during the Cold War, and this was the early Cold War, the CIA was interested in preventing public panic. Okay, they were concerned that a UFO flap period when lots of people are reporting UFOs, that this would precipitate a loss of public order. So that's the first aspect, and you have to consider this in the context of the Cold War and anti-communism. So there was a fear by the government that, and American society generally, about communist infiltration, the use of front groups and spies, okay, the American Communist Party as an instrument of the Kremlin, and individuals who are accused of being communists for various reasons. So that's the backdrop, okay, and flying saucers would be another headache for the government to have to deal with. The other aspect is air vulnerability. So back then, the American Defense Network was very much still relying on ground observers. So citizens could call in to the military and they could, report what they were seeing. It could have been a Soviet plane potentially carrying a nuclear bomb towards a city in America. So the military, of course, would want to know about that, and they've got these channels to allow citizens to, report what they're seeing in the sky. Now, what if these citizens are instead calling in about a bunch of irrelevant UFOs? They're going to be clogging up those reporting channels, wasting the time of the military, and making it harder for them to respond to and detect actual threats in progress. So you can imagine the Soviets would try to take advantage of that, right? They would potentially just use a flap while it's going on to screen their attack, or they could even exacerbate that flap by injecting fake UFO reports, maybe getting their own moles within the US to call into the military. They might also use civilian UFO groups to do that for them. These groups themselves were often suspected of communist sympathies, and they were investigated by the FBI for that reason. But that would also, to the extent that they were pro-communist, that would also make them perhaps more willing to act as pawns for the Soviet Union and to spread these UFO stories. Okay, so for those sorts of reasons, the CIA was very concerned about UFOs. There's also a psychological warfare aspect that the CIA itself would want to exploit against its enemies in the Eastern Bloc. So they were, thinking about, well, if the Soviets can potentially use UFOs as a cover for an attack, then why shouldn't we try to do that? So it was a defensive but also offensive aspect to this. So the Robertson panel was a CIA-sponsored committee, and I forget if it was within the CIA, but it was definitely linked to the CIA. They came up with a recommendation in their report, which was, I believe, declassified in the 1960s, but it was speaking to the situation in the 1950s. So the report basically recommended that the US government should engage in a program of indoctrination to make the American public less kind of susceptible to sensationalism about UFOs and to downplay the importance of UFOs, to convince Americans that there's really nothing weird going on. And that would also have the effect of making them less vulnerable to Soviet influence and manipulation, to the extent that the Soviets would try to use that flap as a cover for their attack, okay? But at the same time, as I mentioned, the American government was also looking at ways to maybe use this in, covert operations of their own, against America's enemies. So that's sort of the backdrop of that. That's already pretty interesting and very different to what a lot of people assume would be the American government rationale for being interested in UFOs. The rationale for the Robertson panel's conclusions would eventually fade with better delivery systems for bombs, namely ICBMs and other missiles, and faster jets, and also more accurate and long-range detection machinery like radar, which was continuously improving. So the importance of ground observers became less and less over time, and so the original rationale for the Robertson panel started to kind of fade away. Now, interestingly, and the book also talks about this aspect, later on, or even during, shortly after all this, into the 1960s, there's an argument to be made that the government actually kind of switched its position, and instead of seeing UFOs as a kind of a nuisance that they want to debunk, they might in some way encourage or at least allow UFO beliefs to proliferate, because this would act as a kind of a cover for American aerospace classified projects, like at Groom Lake, Area 51, right? The CIA itself put out a report, I think in 1996 or so, saying that, or was it in 2000? Anyway, it was around that period, that something like half of all American UFO sightings during the 50s were actually of the U-2 spy plane, okay, the high altitude reconnaissance spy plane. I don't know if that's true or not, but it does speak to a certain possibility that the government would see UFOs as a useful instrument at times to cover up their own projects. There's also the Paul Benowitz affair, of course, involving Air Force intelligence and Richard Doty, who was a FOSI agent, Air Force intelligence, or Air Force Office of Special Investigations, who was supposedly kind of encouraging Paul Benowitz to believe that there were flying saucers or UFOs coming out of Kirtland Air Force Base in order to cover up the projects going on at the base. Now, that's, it hasn't been proven that they were doing that. You have to take anything that Doty says with a huge grain of salt. But there is some circumstantial evidence to suggest that that story does have a large basis of reality. And if so, that would suggest a switch in strategy from the earlier debunking effort to a more I guess you would call it disinformation aspect or effort to encourage belief in UFOs, to act as cover for secret programs. So that's also very interesting. Again, doesn't speak to any actual alien spacecraft. It just is a way for the government to cover things up, potentially. More recently, there's another aspect which has to do with intelligence gathering. This is, if you think about what's going on with the, like the balloons which have China sent over America recently, balloons which have been seen on the east coast of America, probably released from Cuba, because China has got a electronic intelligence base there. They soak up all this electronic intelligence from America. That's going to be used in a war with America if there's a war over Taiwan or a general nuclear war. Okay, drones as well. drones are ubiquitous now, and some of them have been mistaken for UFOs, and many balloons have been mistaken for UFOs. Many pilots on the East Coast, Navy pilots especially, have reported UFOs, which later turned out to be balloons. Now, the government and the Pentagon have put out reports about UFOs in recent years, and the latest one mentioned that almost half of the sightings that they had been investigating turned out to be balloons. Now, the interesting thing there is that people like Jay Stratton have been involved in UFO investigations for the government. He was involved with ORSAP, which was the Pentagon program, which was actually looking at Skinwalker Ranch phenomena. So I talked about that in the previous video about David Grush, and Jay Stratton was David Grush's boss at UAPTF. But Grush is a really kind of strong believer in paranormalism and UFOs. Okay, so goodness knows how many more sightings would have been resolved as balloons or other mundane things if not for people like Stratton. So that provides a kind of cause for concern, I would think, because if people like him are involved in these investigations, then this could make America more vulnerable to espionage, because many of these cases are not being resolved properly because there's a commitment to paranormal or UFO beliefs. Okay, so there's going to be these gaps which the Russians and the Chinese can then exploit, and that's a huge problem. They're going to be able to collect all this intelligence about America and its predispositions and its forces, its electronic order of battle, and that's going to be useful for any conflict in any theater. So that's a concern, I think. So in other words, the government involvement the focus has shifted over time. It was first to do with preventing public panic and avoiding air vulnerability. Then it became arguably disinformation to encourage UFO belief in order to cover up certain aerospace projects. And now the concern is that certain people within the IC and military are naive, or they've got paranormal or UFO commitments that make American detection of enemy sensors, especially electronic intelligence sensors, more difficult. And that's a very big concern that should be looked at. So anyway, I thought that was all very interesting. This is an evolving story. There's many parallels to the past. As somebody said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And there's certainly some rhyming going on right now. Anyway, I hope you got something from that, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.